Hello, it's Andrew at Big Y Fly Company. We're going to talk about hatches. I just want to help you prepare for an inevitable day of trout fishing where you're out there and there's a hatch going off, and you should be prepared for that. A lot of guys are prepared for that if they have a parachute Adams and a hare's ear, but there's a lot more to it than just a nymph and a dry. Especially with a mayfly hatch, you've got a bunch of different parts of a hatch. Mayflies are a little bit more complicated than a catice or a stonefly. They have a little bit more complicated life cycle. They're the preferred food source in a lot of rivers and the primary food source in a lot of rivers. And when there's a mayfly hatch going on, a lot of times the trout are really dumb, just the way we like them. So you may show up at the river in the morning, all prepared for a full day of trout fishing. Could be really early. Maybe you and your buddy are throwing different general attractors. We got, your Adams, you got Catice, you got anything else going off. But what I tend to do is start off, especially when I don't see any activity on the water, is I'm going to start off with a general attractor like a pheasant tail, a hare's ear, prince nymph, something that I know works on multiple levels during any number of hatches. Those are all great flies, and they should all be in your box pretty much all the time. So that goes on for a little while. The day's going on, and maybe an hour or two into the day, you start seeing a couple of heads pop up. You maybe see a few bugs coming off, but you're starting to see signs that the day's getting better. There's a hatch going to start. Fish are going to start getting really happy. So at that point, I'm going to put on a more specific nymph. There's not enough activity on the surface for me to really focus on throwing dries yet. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on a really specific nymph. Say PMD, there's some really good specific PMD nymphs. A lightning bug and a disco midge are two of my favorites during that hatch. And but everybody else has, everybody's got their own personal favorites, but something that's a little more specific towards that exact bug that you're looking at. As that hatch starts, those fish are going to move generally into riffles. They're going to move a little closer to shore, and that's a good sign that things are about to get real good. If you're fishing a riffle and there's fish in there, at that point you start seeing a few more risers. Fish are in the riffle. Things are looking good. It may be time to start putting on an emerger. An emerger is that mayfly that's coming out of its shell. It's basically a floating nymph on top, sometimes with a little part of a shuck on it. That is really going to be a good fly for you early in a hatch, early in the day. And as that hatch starts to move on, and maybe you're starting to see quite a few bugs come off, you start to see a few fish rising, I might move right on to the full dry, which is like, say, a parachute. I love a good old parachute. It's my go-to, but there's a lot of other great dries out there for any specific hatch. So I'm going to fish that dry. I'm going to fish it for quite a while, and usually what happens, especially if you're in the Rocky Mountains and the mayfly hatch is just going crazy, there could be so many mayflies out there you can't tell what's going on. The fish are just going nuts. At that point, I go to a cripple. The cripple gives them something else to look at, and a cripple is easy prey. The fish can just reach up, they can just grab it. That cripple's not moving at all, but it's also a little bit different, just enough that maybe it grabs their attention. Hopefully that works for you. It usually works out pretty well if you move to a cripple in the middle of a really big, thick hatch. Another good strategy that has been well known, especially in the Rockies for years, is the middle of that big mayfly hatch. Things are going crazy. Throw on the purple. That purple haze is awesome. I don't know why the fish want purple, but if you're matching the right size and the right shape of your fly and in the middle of that hatch, try throwing on a purple. It works. Don't ask me why, but it does. Last step of a mayfly hatch is the spinner fall. Spinner fall can happen anytime. It can be days later. It can be hours later. It's generally not the same bugs. Those insects hatch. They go over. They're generally on a tree. They're molting. Then they come back and do a spinner fall. So if you see a hatch come off and then you see a spinner fall an hour later, probably not the same mayflies, maybe yesterday's, maybe the day before's. But either way, you got to watch out for that spinner fall. It's that one hatch, it's completely overlooked because you don't usually see a ton of spinners. It's not like they're so thick they're crawling all over you. But when you see spinners hovering above the water, big long tails, clear wings, just put on a spinner and try it. It's going to work really well. That usually happens late at night, sometimes early in the morning, but I've seen it happen any time. Could happen in the middle of the day. But it's the one part of a hatch that gets way overlooked. So that's mayflies right there. Catice flies are a little different. They're not so complicated. They don't have that extra molting stage. As far as I know, I'm not an entomologist, but I've never seen a Catice spinner fall. And there's not a whole lot for Catice. They're mergers. It seems to be a nymph and then a dry. And you can do a lot with the dry. There's a lot of skittering dries. They like to bounce along the surface. They like to hover and dip. There's a lot more movement on Catice. So you can mess around with a little bit with like skating the fly along the surface. And you can also get several types of Catice hatching together. I mean, I've seen the little black ones, the big brown ones, the giant orange ones, and the medium-sized green ones all hatching at the same time. And that is good luck. Try to figure out which one they're eating, but I try to give them something that attracts their attention. The big one, skating it, sinking it, doing something a little out of the ordinary. And the last thing we'll talk about is stoneflies. And stoneflies are similar to Catice flies as they're going to crawl to the shore, they're going to hatch, they're going to dry out, they're going to come lay their eggs and fly off. So you're not fishing in a merger, they're not hatching out in the middle of the water. So really you have the nymphs and you have the dries, and then you have a third stage that people call the mutants, which is if that bug fell off its branch before its wings had dried out, or before it had completely let its wings out after it hatched. Then it falls in the river and it's what we call a mutant. It can't fly, so it's got to figure out how to get back to shore. So at that point, it's either going to sink and try to swim, it's going to try to swim across the surface, like skate across the surface. And that's really good prey. So a lot of guys will fish either a nymph right on the surface, they may sink a full adult, or they may try to skate some flies. All of those seem to work pretty well. If those fish are going after stoneflies, it's sometimes really hard to fish it wrong. So don't be afraid to mess around with your strategy a little bit, especially in the middle of a big hatch and things aren't going right and you think you're doing everything right. Don't be afraid to skate a fly, to sink a dry, to float a nymph. So those are some strategies you can look at when approaching a day of trout fishing. If you have any questions about that, feel free to give us a call. Visit us online, or we're usually on live chat. Happy to help. Thanks for stopping by.